Hi, LA Progressive friends and readers. We're delighted to be joined today by Nadia Ahmad, a law professor in Orlando, Florida, who's a fellow at the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, a PhD candidate at Yale University in Environmental Studies, and the co-founder of Ceasefire 2024. Thanks so much for joining us, Nadia.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here today with you, Dick and Sharon.
So recently, you've written a couple articles about the third party surge, and here we are on the eve of the morning before the big debate, at a time when lots of people, an extraordinarily high number of voters and observers, aren't crazy about either candidate. And partly because of that, they're looking hard at third-party possibilities. How do you think this new interest in third-party candidates will affect this particular race?
Yeah, I think it's really troubling to see the rise of third parties because it means that the two-party system hasn't worked. And the reason the two-party system hasn't worked is because there's a strong push of dark money in politics, along with this large media empires. And that's why what LA Progressive does is so important. It basically gives a voice to those who don't have a space in mainstream media. And so for me, what I've seen the rise of the third parties, it's basically a combustion factor that people who have become disenchanted with the two-party system are willing to vote for a third party. So whether it is for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or to vote for Cornel West or Jill Stein, or even for libertarian candidates, there's just there's more of an appetite, I think, in this election cycle than in other election cycles, which has a potential to really impact the election in ways that we haven't seen before. And also, I think there's this, what I've seen from both the Republican and the Democratic Party, is to discount certain voters. So even, for example, among African-American voters, they feel that their voice is taken for granted, that their votes are taken for granted. And the same thing also applies for American Muslims in particular. And even if you look at what happened in the Jamal Bowman race, you're seeing the same combustion factor in place, where dark money came in from the Republican parties, from billionaire donors, and had a real impact in politics, and really took away the rights of those who are to really be able to just truly vote without the big money impact in it. And the loss of Jamal Bowman was a really crushing defeat for progressives. But also, I think we have to kind of keep in mind the political realities of what will happen as a result of this election. It will, for people who are in Congress, they want to keep their seats. And so they see that if they are going to side on particular progressive issues, namely Palestine, it may cost them their election. So they may be a little bit more hesitant to speak out in that regard.
That's right. Jamal Bowman, that 16th congressional district in New York City, just happens to be where I was raised. I was born and raised in the Bronx and lived in Edenwald projects for most of my childhood. And it really hurts me to see what happened there. They spent more in opposing Jamal Bowman in that primary than any other primary for a congressional race in the history of the United States. And when you consider how much the average salary is in that congressional district, and how much was spent campaigning against the best interests of the people, it really breaks my heart. I looked at the numbers for that congressional district. Most congressional districts, the number of residents are somewhere around, let's say roughly 725,000, 750,000 people. Less than 50,000 people voted in that election. And so the uncommitted, the disenfranchised, the disengaged, those are the people who we somehow have got to reach. Now, I noticed in one of the pieces that you wrote recently, you talked about the Movement Voter Project, a project that is looking at the uncommitteds. Because if the uncommitteds had been more engaged, I believe that Jamal Bowman, who's one of his statements is the many beats the money. In this case, the money beats the many because the many don't show up. So
Yeah.
go ahead, Nadia, respond,
Yeah,
please.
I mean, that's really like when you hear it now after the fact, it really hurts because really when you go up against Wall Street, like Jamal Bowman did right in Wall Street's backyard, Wall Street's gonna come after you, like, because Wall Street knows what's at stake in a congressional seat. It's about funding, putting money into communities versus sending money off to corporations. And that's what the seats in Congress mean. And that's why $20 million means a lot of money if it means billions of dollars of tax breaks. And so if you're a corporation, if you're a billionaire, you don't have problems spending or putting up millions of dollars in a congressional race if you're going to get billions in tax credits, as well as have your particular corporate interest met by your congressional representative. And that's what we really saw happen, is that the money aligned where the big money wanted it to. And so I think to the extent that we can break that and really take the dark money out of politics, is something that really needs to happen. And that's why there's been this desire now to see more third-party candidates, especially in the presidential election. Another group that I think you should keep an eye out for is the Working People's Party, Working Families Party. I think they've also been doing a lot of organizing, and I think like you're going to see those types of movements as well.
So in your analysis of the third-party surge, you say that that's fueled by concerns about education, immigration, and climate change. And then you leave out, you say, as a Muslim American woman, you leave out foreign policy, or let's say Gaza in particular, because you don't think the DNC cares to listen to you. But it seems to me that that's really the issue that's going to inflame or drive away, especially the young people. But a lot of people, a lot of more traditional leftists are deeply up in arms about our unbridled support for Israel. Israel, I mean, it seems, it's, what is it now, 40, 50,000 Palestinians murdered? And that's the kind of issue that's, I'm old enough to have participated in the anti-war movement in Vietnam. And the Democratic Party's late opposition to that party drove a lot of young people away from politics, perhaps, but away from the Democratic Party. And I see the same thing happening here, not especially among Muslim American students, but among Jewish students, among all students. I think that's going to be the thing that's going to fuel real change. How do you feel about that?
So what I've seen is that from the Democratic Party's perspective, they don't want to hear about Gaza, but they are still trying to sell immigration. They're still trying to sell climate education, as well as healthcare. Like they're still trying to sell those things. But even in those like 4 or 5 sectors, and you can, for example, also add in like childcare. Like for those issues, there has been a desire to have real change from the Democratic Party, but the reason why that they're not going to be listening to messaging around Gaza is because they just kind of they kind of shut their ears to that. They don't want to hear it. So I think if you really want to get through to them, I think it's important to kind of show the hypocrisy on climate, and showing that, for example, if you're spending $1 trillion on war every year, which the United States is doing through the Department of Defense, how are you going to be protecting the climate? How are you going to have student debt elimination? How are you going to be able to respond to the healthcare crisis? All this money is being spent on the military. You also have a lot of people who are upset about the immigration rights, and also what President Biden has done with the asylum policy. And this is something, and when I tell people about them, they're like, oh, the courts aren't going to hold it up. But even if the courts aren't going to hold it up, it's just that this is where the administration is standing on the issue. And so they feel like groups among young voters, climate voters, and immigrant rights voters, they feel that they've had the Democratic Party turn their back to them. And especially on the issue of Gaza, like I've seen that the politicians, they just completely don't want to hear about it at all. And this is again, like, but at the same time, they're met with protests everywhere they go. They can't have public events. Even the campaign has such strict security protocols that you can't really campaign when you're so worried that somebody's going to be protesting your event. And only when they've been able to contain the campaign and really prevent any protests and prevent the media from picking up on the protest has that been effective. So that's why, for example, when you had the encampments that were happening, Fox News was running that like back to back to back to back, showing that the administration doesn't have these college campuses in control. They're being overrun by liberals. And at the same time, you saw what the White House, along with the different cities, especially like New York City, they shut down the encampments as much as they could. And it happened from the level of university administration. It happened from the New York Police Department and from the mayor's office. They were all had alignment that we need to shut down these protests, even though these protests and encampments emerged as a direct result of youth mobilization. And if you look at like the numbers of students who were arrested, like in the range of 3,500 to 4,000, however many students who were arrested, for each one student you had arrested, you probably had at least 100 to 150 students behind them. So these are all like people who are not like, if somebody is willing to go get arrested on an issue, like that means they feel very strongly about it. And the people who were not arrested also felt like some level of guilt that they also did not get arrested. And so these are all people who would essentially be working to support a campaign, are now working on a campaign to eliminate and end the genocide in Gaza. So you see like where the big money is in politics, how it impacts a congressional election. But when there's only one race that's happening, like you had in the New York race that they focused on primarily, they can't do that nationwide. That's why like when you look at the money versus the mini can win when you have a larger race.
I absolutely believe that the many can win when we have a larger race, but I think that we really do need more fundamental change. You know, we've been down this road before. Dick and I are old enough to remember 1971, you know, when the Powell Memo was issued. I remember the 60s and the protests that were going on at Columbia University. Dick was a student at Columbia University. The powers that be, they know their history, and they know that this eventually will die down. Sadly, what's happening with climate is not something that's going to die down. It's something that's going to continue to impact us all in a very negative way, but the people that benefit from it are only interested in their short-term gain. So I don't know, I'm not so clear that we as a progressive movement have come up with some solutions, because it kind of looks like we're just doing the same old thing that we've done in the past, and we need radical fundamental change now, because the climate thing is such a crisis.
Well, I think the fundamental change that will be happening as a result of the climate change is that you're just going to have like levels of mass extinction of both, not just biodiversity, but with human life. By the year 2050, tens of millions of people will be dying as a result of the climate crisis. And we can mitigate it now, but we can't do it when we're spending $1 trillion on war each year.
Yeah.
It requires like a large number of capital investment. And if you are going to bomb countries, you can also be funding or financing their climate projects as well. It just doesn't work that way. And so this is another thing that they're okay with. Like they're okay with people dying. The same way they're okay with 40,000 people dying in Gaza, like they're okay with that. And I think to really kind of understand this corporatist structure that exists within not just the upper echelons of political power, but across sectors of corporations and the media elite, and also within academia as well, because there's this sense of like, even within academia, that the people don't want to speak out on Gaza. They also don't want to speak out against like the military industrial complex. They also don't want to speak out about the tech industrial complex that is also using AI to fuel the genocide. And so all of these confluence of factors put together impact why there is not like a clear mobilization in one sense, but really a sense of disenfranchisement.
So in your piece, in one of your pieces, you identify yourself as a Muslim DNC member of the Democratic Party apparatus. And so is your thought that you want to have the Democratic Party wake up and change its course on environment and immigration and the Middle East and the Ukraine, Or are you thinking that we're better off if there was a rise in the creation of real third-party movements?
Well, I think, for example, if you look at the case of Mexico, where you saw like new political parties form, and also I think maybe the two-party system hasn't served us well. If we look, for example, even in India, where you have like a large movements that have developed as well, like you saw, for example, like my grandmother's generation, they overthrew the British Raj, like they ended colonialism. And my grandmother in particular, one of the things that she had done when she was like when she was an activist, yeah, like when they were fighting the colonial regime, is that she would put together. And I didn't know about this like until years later, where somebody just mentioned that, like saying, "Oh, your grandmother was so radical, she would have like a biga dupatta." And I didn't know what that was. Like I don't know what. So what that actually means is like a wet dupatta, like a wet scarf, and like she would go around and they would like do it as like a sign to kind of like shame her. That's how like she was like so radical. But I was like, why would she need like a wet scarf? They're like, because when they came with the tear gas, they had the wet scarf, so that like when they tried to like, you know, like when you get the impact of the tear gas in particular, and you want to be able to respond to it, you have the scarf there to kind of lessen the impact of the tear gas. Like once it's wet, it kind of it can't impact you, and you kind of take the scarf off your face or whatever when you do that.
Wow, that's amazing. So did your grandmother, did you know your grandmother?
Yeah, so I knew my grandmother. Like I actually grew up with my grandparents in Florida. Like they also immigrated to the United States from India and Pakistan, and so like that was like something like very radical. Like, you know, to go against your family as a woman, to go to these protests and marches that they had to end colonialism. And I think this is kind of like the same thing. Like I feel like it skips a generation when it does happen, and that's what we see happening now. So when we saw the Vietnam War era protests that you were involved with, it didn't happen right away. So it saw it happening in the 60s and 70s in the US, and now we see it happening again. Like where will people like be willing to kind of throw down on the system? And that's what we're seeing happening. Like another one of your writers who has really been important and influential to me is Marcy Winograd. And she always says, like, you know, like we were the generation that ended the Vietnam War, and like everything that happened during the Vietnam War, for it to happen like in a broader context. That's what I think we need to see, is that how to what extent are people really willing to throw down?
Absolutely. So yeah, Marcy Winograd is not only is she a contributor to the LA Progressive, but she really is a dear friend. And you're right, she does share some words of wisdom, and she's had so many experiences that this younger generation can benefit from learning from. So I'm so interested in, you know, your experience of having your grandmother help to overthrow the settler colonies in India. In your experience, did you see any internalization of the colonial experience in your culture, and how have you personally been able, if you see it, how have you personally been able to root that out?
So I think for me, like one of the things to look at, it's not like a black and white issue, black and brown and white issue per se, because if you look at it, like the reason British were able to colonize India for 500 years is because they were able to create this colonial inferiority complex. Like they were able to get thousands, millions of people to really buy into the colonial project and also be subservient to that project. And that's where I think people here need to wake up and see that we have that same process here where people are willing to accept it. And that's why I think, like, if they're buying into, like, if they're comfortable, then they're not willing to protest and really reject that system. And so that's what I see in the US, especially, even among like American Muslim political organizing. And even I think even among like traditional environmental organizing, I do a lot of work in environmental justice. Like the way the system worked at a certain point, like these larger environmental organizations, they didn't really consider environmental justice a real important issue issue, that minority communities, poor people, and tribal communities were impacted by the environment in a different way. But that's why we have environmental justice movement, is because the rights that were put in place in the 60s and 70s for environmental rights, whether it's the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all of those things were put in place to protect white spaces. Environmental justice movement grew because that wasn't enough for those communities. And so I think we also need to see as well, like people have kind of bought into the system to a certain extent. And unless they're willing to kind of walk away from it, that's where we have to be at. Like you can't just have a seat at the table. You have to be willing to flip that table.
This is so exciting. So what you said just now about, well, I'll put it in my words, the apathy that we see in the United States, especially when you consider, I'm going to go back to the Jamal Bowman conversation, where you had 720,000 people in a congressional district, and he got less than 25,000 votes. His opponent got less than 30,000. That apathy, I think, is analogous to this internalized feeling of not having agency, not having power, just sort of walking away from the reins of control of government because the people there don't believe that they actually can do something. And so I'm always excited to hear when there have been successes, like the success that your grandmother experienced. We can do that too in this country.
Yeah, and I think so. I think it really requires like a radical shift, though. Like we can't accept the status quo. And for my grandmother, it was somebody who did not get beyond like a fifth, sixth grade education. So it's not about being educated. It's about being willing to change the system. And so for her, that meant taking to the streets. And I think, and also kind of willing to reject like the cultural conformities that women shouldn't go outside the house, they shouldn't do this or that. And so I think that that's something that's important to recognize, is that you don't need to have a lot of funding or political power to be able to make a change in the system. You just have to understand the way the system works. And for me, that was like, I paid attention in my 8th grade civics class. You know, I read, like I also read a book from my former senator who passed away this year, Bob Graham, who was like served as a governor, was also a senator, was actually a great statesman. I didn't agree with him on a lot of positions, but he's a great statesman. He had also written a small, like it was like a booklet, a little bit more than a pamphlet about how to get involved in government. And one of the issues he raised was about how students in Georgetown were trying to protest against like parking policies and the way the local government was impacting how their quality of life. And so how they also organized their students themselves to kind of impact the local political situation. And so there's ways that you can have pockets of change, and then it'll kind of catalyze a larger level of change. And so I think while the movement like may feel like down in some ways, I think that I think we also need to sit back and look at what we have done in the past 8 months that has like people we've talked to, things we've done, and events we've organized, in ways that like we would not have done before. It's really kind of catalyzed change, and to really get us to get over that tipping point is something that is also very possible. And for me, like it was writing for the LA Progressive. Anytime like I felt like, okay, I can't get this out, I'm gonna write it down, send it over to Dick, he's gonna put that out there. So whether it resonates or not, it's like I think it's important that wherever we are, like we do what we can.
So we know and perhaps are friends with Cornel West and Marianne Williamson, or certainly friends with West's VP candidate Melina Abdullah, and I think they play a wonderful role in raising issues and pointing out things and agitating people and telling a greater truth than anybody, it seems, in the Democratic Party and certainly in the Republican Party. But the truth is, none of them are going to be president. Melina might live long enough, but none of them are going to be president. But it seems to me that here, living in pretty liberal Los Angeles and a pretty liberal part of it, that there is the energy coming together, perhaps, to form a real third party with a socialist bent. I actually think that's the way the change has to come. I think it's going to come more from the bottom up. I think it's coming from the bottom up more than any attempt at the top down.
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the things, for example, my middle daughter, she was 7 years old when Trump was elected president. No, she was a little bit younger than that, but she was born in the year 2014. So when she was born in that year in 2014, it was the first year the majority of people who were born were people of color. And so that like naturally will have a change in the political system going forward. So right now she's 10. And my math is not that great. So but I know she's 10 right now. So by the time she's 18, like that's going to be a different voter population that will be out there. And then my other daughter who's almost turning 7, she's in a different category because she was kind of born post-Trump. Like I had her because I thought Trump was going to come to power and we were all going to be put into detention facilities. And I thought, okay, if I'm pregnant, then maybe that won't happen to me and I can like be in a protected class or something like that. But I felt that like we can have change. And maybe if it's just within our children, but I think we definitely are going to see change. I see the change happening with young people, especially like as a college professor. Like I see that like there's different people who are in power and also versus who want to kind of change the system as well. In Florida, for example, we elected the first Gen Z member of Congress, Maxwell Frost. And so I think we're starting to see the change. And for me, I think it's just a matter of still putting in the hard work. I think we need to really drive people to the polls. They have to vote. And if they have to vote their conscience. And I think that's important to do. I think we definitely have a potential for a multi-party platforms within the United States because I think it's healthy for democracy to have more voices involved. And to the extent that we have people willing to break that grapple of the two-party system is important. Even within the Democratic Party, I endorsed Marianne Williamson for president because I felt that she was the one who provided most vision and what aligned most with my own goals and views of the party. And so I think and the reason why I think it was important for her to like have a platform is because then it elevates her voices as well within the media and to really shift the conversation and be a part of that conversation. Like I thought it would have been great to have on the debate stage, not just Biden and Trump, but also Kennedy, West, along with Stein. Like I think that would have led to a more impactful debate to be more representative of the views of the United States people.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nadia. It's just been such a pleasure chatting with you, and I'd like to do this again. You've got just a lot of information to share. And the next time we talk, I want to talk about what it's like to hold your political views and live in the state of Florida. That can't be easy.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I'll either have to bring like a box of tissues or a baseball bat for that.
Oh my gosh. Alrighty.
This is delightful. Keep sending articles,
Okay.
Nadia. We'll set up another talk sometime. Thank you so much.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.
So long. Bye-bye.
right.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.